So the subject is going to be psychedelics and kind of the modern era, modern Western civilization, kind of the connections between them, and how the visionary and psychedelic experience and shamanism kind of had an impact or influenced contemporary civilization ultimately. Although in this week we're going to get through kind of into the late 60s, early 70s, then we'll pick it up next time. So yeah, in preparing this week, I went down this rabbit hole of rereading some philosophy from the Frankfurt School, a book called The Dialectic of Enlightenment. That was by Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer. And these were Frankfurt School philosophers, Germans who escaped Nazi Europe. And they were really trying to figure out where modern civilization had taken a wrong turn or gone wrong. And they wrote this extraordinary work, The Dialectic of Enlightenment. I talked about Walter Benjamin last time, and I'm going to talk about him again this week because he's so crucial to my thinking. But he was also peripherally connected to the Frankfurt School. And what the writers realized, Adorno and Horkheimer, is that there was a real problem where the Enlightenment put out this idea of liberation through science and rationalism and technology, and kind of expunging magical thought, mythological thought, and that this idea that this development of empiricism, instrumental reason, mathematics, physics, science, technology would really be the tool for liberating humanity from the past. But when they began to discover, with the rise of fascism and even just corporate, culture and capitalism and so on, that the Enlightenment path seemed to lead towards domination and control and even a totalitarian control system. I think that one reason I've been thinking about this so much this week has also been around everything that's happening, with the coronavirus, with the vaccine, with the pandemic, with kind of the increase of internet censorship. I was kind of surprised in a way to see that Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's considered kind of the leading anti-vax activist, was thrown off of Instagram, even though he's still on Facebook, same company, but they wanted to limit his reach in a way. And it just, we're in this situation now where we have these kind of arbitrary private companies that are able to kind of censor, control, public information and so on. And yeah, I want to write about it. I'm doing a lot of kind of soul searching as to why that I'd interviewed Robert F. Kennedy like a month and a half ago, and was challenging in my interview. I don't agree with him with everything, and in fact, I think that he tends to cherry pick evidence to support his case, and sometimes it's not totally supported by evidence what he says, and and yet in some ways, I feel that he has an important, he's making an important point. So there's things that I learned about through other people that he interviewed on Instagram that I also found was, kind of very, very important, including interviews he did with this economist, Catherine Austin Fitts, who was a conservative economist who worked, I think, under the Bush era, and now is really somebody who's calling out, an alarm around kind of the Great Reset, the kind of potential transformation of the financial system to benefit the elites. And so, Kennedy was putting out a lot of information for popular consumption, not just about vaccines, but about the economic system and the scientific establishment and so on, just to shut him down, or at least, massively limit his reach. It was kind of shocking. But I'm also was noticing my own response to it was so different from my response to Trump or Alex Jones being censored. So it's stirred up a lot, and I think there's some philosophical layers that our civilization, society needs to begin to inquire into. And actually, I think this book, The Dialectic of Enlightenment, is a very powerful book right now, kind of a forgotten book, but to kind of think about where we're at as a society, and how this sort of idea of instrumental rationality and technology and science has taken this kind of totalitarian role in our society. And in a way, it's seems to be in conflict with individuality, with self-sovereignty, with freedom, in its, stated desire to protect and safeguard humanity from itself in some ways. Anyway, so what Adorno and Horkheimer realized was that in the Enlightenment program, the Enlightenment began in the 18th century, thinkers like Voltaire, Rousseau, and Immanuel Kant, and it was very much about what they talk about as the disenchantment of the world. It was seeking to dispel myths, the magical past, animism, to overthrow fantasy with knowledge. But that knowledge was very much knowledge attained through, senses, empirical investigation, rationality. But the problem with it is it inexorably reduces human beings to the status of things. They talk about how, with our technology, what we're seeking to learn from nature is how to wholly dominate both nature and human beings. Nothing else counts. And once again, I find this a powerful statement in terms of many trends that are happening right now, including stuff that I explored in this recent essay book, Conspiranoia, around even like the Chinese and their biowarfare program, the question of whether coronavirus was somehow related to, the coronavirus. Coronavirus related to the biowarfare efforts of the Chinese. So, they also talk about how Enlightenment was a kind of, the idea of a dialectic. Enlightenment was a dialectical antithesis to animism, the magical worldview, the Shamanic worldview, and in some ways it both repressed and inverted pre-modern animism and magic. But in the same act of repressing it, it kind of reinstates it on another level. It's kind of what their thesis is. So one of the things they say is existence, thoroughly cleansed of demons and their conceptual descendants, takes on in its gleaming naturalness the numinous character which former ages attributed to demons. So there's this quality of the repression and then the return of the oppressed in a different form. A quote from Nietzsche. So Nietzsche was a late 19th century philosopher who obviously was very concerned with rationalism and the Enlightenment, and also saw this complex interplay between irrationality and Nietzsche was famous for writing about the death of God, but he noted that with the death of God, there was also kind of like a disappearance of the subject. It's like if you don't have a transcendent reality, what is the real reality? It's just something that has no actual reality because, once we've passed away or we've gone, there's just a total annihilation or obliteration. So Nietzsche said, we have abolished the real world being the mythological world, the divine world, sacred world. What world is left? The apparent world, perhaps, the apparent world, the world of the senses, the world of phenomena. But no, with the real world, we've also abolished the apparent world. So, Nietzsche was really fascinated with this question and, saw the tragic dimensions of it and ultimately tried to create his own kind of mythology, some way to kind of reestablish meaning in the world through the myth of the eternal return, this idea that everything happens like over and over again. And in a way, he felt that was an effort to create a new mythological kind of thought structure. This was one of the statements from the Dialectic of Enlightenment. Animism had endowed things with souls. Industrialism makes souls into things. So I think that's, very fascinating. So in an animistic worldview, everything has a soul. And, you find that in the psychedelic shamanic world, trees have souls. If you explore a substance like Salvia divinorum, you might discover your couch has a soul, your lamp or your television or something. So you're in this world where everything has a soul. And meanwhile, in the industrial society, the soul has been totally banished, not only from trees and from plants, but everything is just a thing, kind of an inert object. So the Dialectic of Enlightenment, so they saw this Enlightenment was a process of suppressing the magical animistic world of the shamans, and at the same time, it brought continued aspects of that world in a different form. So they talked about how there was a relationship between animistic magic and instrumental reason were both tools, both methods or techniques for controlling physical forces in the world, but they do it quite differently. Magic uses mimesis, the sympathy between our soul or our consciousness and the soul or the consciousness in wood or fire or water or in the spirit world, whereas science uses pure mathematics and empiricism to control the physical forces of the world. They looked at how the division of labor in tribal societies, between the shaman and the other people, kind of the shaman as the knowledge holder, as the expert, prefigured the professional divisions we find in modern society. The magical world recognized the universal force or energy, a mana, underlying everything that could be tapped into. In the Enlightenment paradigm, we've reduced all qualities to sameness, to equivalences, and that's the power that we can use to control everything through mathematics, through technologies, through code. I mean, that's where we're seeing with the the virus, the vaccines for the coronavirus. It's this kind of exhilaration of our capacity to now master the intricacies of the DNA code, to use computers to control, to shape something in a way just that fits into our capacity to create a computer-based vaccine on such an incredibly intricate level that's able to identify the spike program and train the immune system to utilize it. So now we're in this world where code is seen as the underlying reality, whereas previously it was matter, or this universal energy. In the mythological or magical worldview, it had the structure of sacrifice, renunciation, and atonement. And in some ways, according to Adorno and Horkheimer, these have been integrated into the Enlightenment paradigm, where you had to renounce magic and animism. You had to sacrifice any belief in anything outside of the equivalence of everything, the sameness in everything. All non-empirical beliefs had to be driven away, almost like they were sinful, or you had to atone for them. In the Dialectic of Enlightenment, they talk about on our way to modern science, human beings have discarded meaning. The concept is replaced by the formula, the cause by rules and probability. So I just, over the week kept reflecting on this idea in different forms. This was kind of an idea that was from Breaking Up in the Head, how in order to attain the rational worldview of the modern psyche, the capitalism, scientific materialist worldview, it somehow seems to have required a kind of dialectical, let's say, negation, repression of the pre-modern communal structures, animistic beliefs, whether they were found in Europe through the stamped out through the Inquisition or stamped out in the New World through colonialism and Christianity. Karl Marx talked about how one of the effects of capitalism is it alienates us from all of our physical and intellectual senses. And, it prioritizes only one sense, which is actually not even a real sense. It's kind of an illusion of a sense, which is the sense of having. So we've alienated ourselves from all of our senses except this idea of having or possessing or ownership as kind of the ultimate value in a capitalist system. Another Frankfurt School philosopher was Herbert Marcuse, who wrote a number of amazing works, including One-Dimensional Man. One of the quotes from that book is, the union of growing productivity and growing destruction, the bricksmanship of annihilation, the surrender of thought, hope, and fear to the decisions of the powers that be, the preservation of misery in the face of unprecedented wealth constitute the most impartial indictment, even if they are not the raison d'etre of this society, but only its byproduct. Its sweeping rationality, which propels efficiency and growth, is itself irrational. So Marcuse kind of honed in on this core idea of the irrational rationality that makes up our modern system. And it's very clear when we look at the fact that, for decades, we've had, the resources and the technical capacity to fulfill the needs of humanity totally, as Buckminster Fuller realized back in the 60s, we haven't done so. And instead, we've created a system that creates tremendous wealth and excess on one hand, and on the other hand, leaves millions, hundreds of millions of people on the brink of starvation, unable to fend for themselves, and so on. So yeah, now sort of go back into the historical framing a little bit. I mean, going back to the Inquisition, which we talked about last time, Carlo Ginsberg wrote a book called Ecstasies, Deciphering the Witch's Sabbath. And in that book, he discovered, or he realized that the use of plants in European culture were responsible for the kind of visionary flights of the witches, the idea of the witch's Sabbath. And he discovered, and to his surprise, and he pretty much started as a skeptic and not himself a user of psychedelics, that there was an unfathomable experience that humanity had symbolically expressed for millennia through myths, fables, rituals, and ecstasies, and remains one of the hidden centers of culture, of the way we exist in the world. And this unfathomable experience was the shamanic trance, the witch's Sabbath, the journey into these other worlds, the bringing back knowledge from the other worlds, the encounters with spirit beings. We talked about it in terms of the Santa Claus myth and the witch's myth. And this was, in the time of the Renaissance and the Inquisition, it was the demonized and suppressed side of consciousness. And yet it informs modern culture. Particularly, let's look at somebody like Shakespeare, A Midsummer Night's Dream. You have the vision of Bottom, who kind of ends up having this experience in the fairy world that is evoked in the drama that was so popular at that time. And basically, Shakespeare was drawing upon, what was coming through the kind of Inquisition in the witch trials. So Ginsberg talks about how there was a witch trial in 1597. So we basically went through the witch trials, transcripts, or whatever evidence there was, and to try to understand the sort of pre-Christian belief system, the animistic belief system that still underlie European culture. So in 1597, Andrew Mann told the judges at Aberdeen that he had paid homage to the Queen of the Elves, the devil, who had appeared to him in the guise of a stag, emerging from the snow on a summer's day during the harvest. His name was Christ Sunday, Sunday of God. Andrew Mann had kissed its behind. The elves had set the tables with food, played music, and danced. They were shadows with the appearance and clothes of human beings. Their queen was very beautiful, and Andrew Mann had coupled with her carnally. So this really, surely something like this was what inspired Shakespeare, who was kind of in that moment when magic and animism became drama, became art, became something that could be celebrated in culture as it was suppressed and reviled in reality and practices. And we can see also how, what we have here is something that's kind of a pre-literate, or let's say pre-Christian animistic vision of reality that's now being forced into a Christian modality with the devil and Christ and so on, given a kind of Christian moralism that the original experience didn't have. So yeah, in the Renaissance, there was kind of the separation of discourses, right? Art, science, alchemy, the occult, they kind of began to separate. And as Northrop Frye wrote about Shakespeare, modern drama is born in the renunciation of magic. And in The Tempest and elsewhere, it remembers its inheritance. So essentially what happened as society complexified, we started to develop science, technology, the artist kind of took the place of the shaman or the magician, and magic as a reality was relegated to the status of delusion and fantasy. Meanwhile, the alchemists like Newton, Isaac Newton, who had a tremendous interest in alchemy, turned into the scientist and the mathematician, the logician, the logical positivist, the rationalist. So the Enlightenment was a time when the separation between kind of ancient forms of thought, kind of participatory modalities of knowing the world, were interrogated and kind of deconstructed. Immanuel Kant was one of the leading Enlightenment philosophers, and one of his main ideas is that we actually can never know reality in itself, what he called the noumena. All we can do is access the phenomena, which is the sense data, through empirical investigation, and we can manipulate it, but beneath it is this the sort of hidden world of the noumena, which is outside of our grasp. Horkheimer and Adorno wrote in the Dialectic of Enlightenment, the mastery of nature draws the circle in which the critique of pure reason holds thought spellbound. There is no being in the world that knowledge cannot penetrate, but what can be penetrated by knowledge is not being. So I found this, once again, kind of very fascinating and kind of resonant idea. So we're saying that we can have knowledge of the things in the world, the empirical facts, the sense data, but there's whatever is behind that, beneath that, is outside of our knowing and we have no access to it. And this separation, I think, really defines post-Enlightenment civilization, the development of science, development of technology, the incredible suspicion and skepticism that most people have about psychic phenomena, the paranormal, the supernatural, anything that has the taint of spirituality or mysticism. Gloria Flaherty wrote a book called Shamanism in the 18th Century, and she talked in that book how even in this time when there was this kind of repression of the magical and the animistic worldview, the figure of the shaman actually was very essential for Europe in defining this new idea of the artist or the scientist in a way. We can see this in an 18th century illustration on the bottom right of a Buryat shaman, which was those illustrations and descriptions circulated all around Europe. It influenced modern cultural kind of expressions like Faust. Flaherty writes, well, some Europeans continued to ridicule what they considered public trickery and ignoble credulity. Others began taking shamanistic practices very seriously. Shamanism seemed to them to epitomize a grand confluence of ageless human activities the world over. So for Flaherty, you can trace the cult of the genius, the idea that the artist has magical powers of enchantment, attributed to somebody like Mozart or Goethe or many modern artists, Picasso. The glamour of the artistic personality actually arose out of the 18th century Europeans' fascination with the figure of the shaman. So there's a poster from Faust, and at the top right is from Cabaret Voltaire, 1917 or 16. That's Hugo Ball, and his costume with the lobster claw hands, kind of imitating, maybe unconsciously, the shamanic archetype of this wild costume, the shamanic personality, the inspired personality. And in Faust, you had all of the sort of tropes of shamanism, communing with spirits, in this case, devils, communing with the land of the dead, taking narcotics, making magic flights, and so on. So the shamanic paradigm, as it was exiled from kind of something being seen as something real and valid and meaningful, was then took power in the cultural imagination through art. And Goethe, is a very interesting figure who we'll probably talk about more in another week. And he, was a Enlightenment figure. I guess he kind of bridged Enlightenment and Romanticism, but he had a different idea of science. He wanted to create more a participatory science. He wrote a famous text about, color and light. He called colors the deeds and sufferings of light. And this is a quote from Arthur Zadrock. Man is a part of nature. In Goethe's philosophy, man is a part of nature, not to be sundered from it for the cause of objectivity. Nature creates organs in man through which he can perceive her. Man responds to nature by his own creative actions. So, basically Goethe was advocating for a participatory science and recognizing that there, unlike, say, Kant, Goethe wouldn't have really envisioned, the noumena and the separation between the noumena and the phenomena. We have the creative capacity to participate with nature. That's why we exist in such a way. And Goethe said, this much is certain. under particular conditions, the antenna of our souls are able to reach out beyond their physical limitations. Yeah, so just a little, bit about Romanticism. So the Romantics, in a way, developed in, recognizing this movement of science, this Enlightenment project, this rationalism, industrialization, the satanic mills that Blake wrote about in London. They kind of wanted to, like Goethe, they kind of, although they'd already sort of separated off from science, but Goethe still maybe saw a link, a bridge between science and art, but they wanted to kind of explore the consciousness, the imagination, almost like experimental scientists or like shamans. And William Blake said, the imagination is not a state, it is the human existence in itself. So they the dream world, consciousness, Coleridge, a lot of them experimented with hashish or opium. Samuel Coleridge talked about, I should much wish, like the Indian Vishnu, to float about along an infinite ocean, cradled in the flower of the lotus, and wake once in a million years for a few minutes, just to know I was going to sleep a million years more. So they were fascinated with the dream world, with the edges of consciousness, hypnagogia. You could look at the dream lyricism of the Romantics as an act of resistance and opposition to, rational empiricism, the development of technology and the Industrial Revolution. They would study things like hypnagogia. A number of the Romantic poets would engage in experiments where they would, if they were going to go to sleep, they would sleep with their hand out of the couch with a spoon or a bell. And as soon as they fell asleep, the spoon or the bell would fall to the floor and clatter and wake them up. And then they would try to remember that moment of falling asleep, which is called the hypnagogic state, and then rediscover it in lyric poetry and so on. So they were in a weird way like scientists of consciousness, which is of course what I would say shamans are, kind of experimental researchers in the dimension of consciousness and non-ordinary states of consciousness. So getting back to Walter Benjamin, who I mentioned was connected to Frankfurt School a bit. As we discussed last time, Walter Benjamin wrote about the dialectics of awakening, the dialectics of intoxication. And in his philosophy, capitalism was not simply like a movement forward, progress toward being adults, being mature, being finally rational, but actually capitalism was a process whereby a new dream-filled sleep came over Europe. And he saw this he wrote a huge book called The Arcades Project, this massive compendium of kind of fragments about the sort of capitalist commodity culture of the late 19th century, and how it created a new dream world and tranced and hypnotized and kind of fixated people with this new utopia of commodities and possessions. For Benjamin, we don't really have a choice as human beings. Somehow or other, we need to commingle with the cosmic powers. And this is either going to happen via consciousness, conscious creative acts, rituals, initiations, or it'll happen through unconscious acts of destruction, wars, ecological disasters. And Benjamin worried that because of capitalism and industrialization and rationalism, we become more and more separate from any idea of the soul and so on, that our alienation from ourselves was deepening to the point where we can experience our own destruction as an aesthetic pleasure of the first order. And once again, I find this very contemporary to me when I look at all the apocalyptic movies that are so popular in the mainstream, whether it's the X-Men or endless disaster movies and so on. Or how, or in the sort of Trumpian, all the people who are following Trump in this kind of like, ritualized death cult in a way. And Benjamin even wrote one fragment that he never published in his life that I found particularly interesting, where he talks about capitalism itself as a cult or a religion, but not a religion that guaranteed salvation, but actually a religion that only guaranteed kind of destruction in a way. Benjamin wrote, capitalism is entirely without precedent, that it is a religion which offers not the reform of existence, but it's complete destruction. There's the expansion of despair until despair becomes a religious state of the world and the hope that this will lead to salvation. So essentially, Christianity, Judeo-Christianity had this idea of the messianic return, that history was this waiting for, the second coming in Christianity, or the messianic return in Judaism. And in capitalism, in a way, inverted this also, and having, through technology and rationality and science, given up any conscious hopes of redemption or salvation. These had still become the suppressed unconscious program in a way. And so the idea was, we continue rationalizing, quantifying, turning the world into number, turning the world into code, seeing it only the world as sameness, its equivalence, kind of reducing the self to a quantity. But this sort of secret underlying hope for Benjamin is that this actually leads to this messianic moment, this the God forced to kind of return to his creation, or the mother forced to return to her creation at some point in the process. Walter Benjamin, definitely saw a lot of value in narcotic escapes. He wrote about his hashish experiences and explored mescaline. And he talked about how, dream or intoxication are necessary to kind of loosen the sense of self, individuality. Dream loosens individuality like a bad teeth. He talked about profane illumination, so the importance of intoxication for perception, or for thinking, to having somewhere you can have an internal separation from your normal consciousness, to see the world differently. He talked about how different states of intoxication were in some weird way humiliating sobriety compared to these other dimensions of reality kind of adjacent to them. I actually found that also to be very resonant with psychedelics. In a way, there is a sense that you almost have a like a deeper sobriety in a psilocybin state or something. You understand the world in a more profound way, let's say. And he contrasted the narcotic dream worlds with the dream world of capitalism, the dream worlds of consumerism. And as I said, he felt that we needed to commingle with cosmic powers. This was just basic to our human existence, and we were either going to do it ritually, creatively, intentionally, or it's just unleashed destructively, out of necessity. We have a need. Humans have a need for ritual and initiation, according to Walter Benjamin. And I mentioned this a little bit, I think, last time through Joseph Chilton Pearce, who wrote a book, The Biology of Transcendence, who found that, maybe even we're biologically wired in terms of the neocortex to seek out transcendent experience, which helps to kind of almost like rewire our brain to give us access to a transpersonal reference point. So for Benjamin, the loss of rituals that compel ecstatic contact with the cosmos are a serious threat for us. It is the dangerous error of modern men to regard this experience as unimportant and unavoidable. It is not. Its hour strikes again and again, and then neither nations nor generations can escape it. And when I went to Burning Man for the first time, actually back in 2000, I really did feel, as somebody who'd read Benjamin and thought about those ideas a lot, that it was an effort to, create an opportunity for contemporary humanity in our current state of being to have that annual ecstatic contact, similar to what the mysteries of Eleusis did for the ancient Greeks. But for Benjamin, he saw the First World War as an attempt at a new and unprecedented commingling with the cosmic powers. And as I mentioned before, he was worried about our level of alienation and what it meant in terms of what might happen in the future. Another kind of footnote in the relationship between psychedelics and the modern world was Sartre, who's normally not associated with psychedelics at all. He tried mescaline in 1935 and had a terrible trip that lasted, the repercussions of it lasted for more than a year, and it inspired his novel Nausea, and may have had an inspiration on the whole existentialist worldview all in all. During his mescaline trip, Sartre saw houses with leering faces, clocks took on the features of owls. He feared that one day he would no longer know whether or not these were hallucinations, and he called it a nervous breakdown. And apparently for the next year, Sartre had this persistent hallucination, that crabs and lobsters were following him around. He said they finally got used to that. I would wake up in the morning and say, "Good morning, my little ones. How did you sleep?" So yeah, okay, guys, we're going to class now. He was a student back then. So we have to be still and quiet. And they would be there around my desk, absolutely still until the bell rang. So once again, I mean, if we're looking at, existentialism is seen as a very non-psychedelic philosophy, but it's kind of interesting, that whatever Sartre's kind of setting was psychologically and textually, culturally and philosophically, led him to have this momentous bad trip, lasting negative repercussions that may have been a very important influence for existentialism. And it's kind of, which is existentialism could very much be seen as part of this demystification process, this rationalization process, that the Enlightenment started. So now I want to talk a little bit about anthropology and its relationship to visionary plants and visionary experience, and go back a little bit to the history of anthropology in the 20th century. Claude Lévi-Strauss, normally known as the father of modern anthropology, French structuralist, but actually, so he worked with different Amazonian tribes in Brazil, the Cadavio and so on. But sadly, he never, as far as I know, had the visionary experience for himself. And in fact, he was extremely dismissive of anthropologists and explorers who brought back any sacred knowledge or any significant knowledge from these cultures. And in a way, there's almost something very nihilistic, I would say, about Lévi-Strauss, who had a tremendous influence on 20th century anthropology. He talked about, he saw anthropology as part of this process of kind of inevitable universal demystification, like a part of this Enlightenment process that was leading to, a world that was only made up of equivalences, a world that was only made up of sameness in a way. So he talked about it as entropology, the idea that anthropology was basically the study of entropy. And that he believed that mass society, monoculture was inevitable and unavoidable, and there was really nothing to do about it. He wrote, "Can it be that I, the elderly predecessor of those scourers of the jungle, am the only one to have brought back nothing but a handful of ashes? Is mine the only voice to bear witness to the impossibility of escapism?" And so when Lévi-Strauss visited this Brazilian tribe, the Cadavio, and studied their, kinship kind of patterns and culture, and he discovered that they, painted their bodies with these incredibly complex figures and decorations, he really couldn't see that those might have a relationship to their visionary experience, their direct knowledge of some other reality. For Lévi-Strauss, I think it's almost like sad in a way, but he said that these body paintings symbolized the institutions that the Cadavio might have had if their interests and superstitions did not stand in the way. So there's such a kind of patriarchal, paternalistic judgment there. It's essentially what in Lévi-Strauss's mind would those institutions have been? They would have been probably like a parliamentary government, like in France, an Academy of Arts and Letters. He was basically saying, they had the capacity to have the same, kind of benefits of this modern demystified world of progress, but their superstitions, as he called them, did not, stood in the way. So it's just, once again, that this a lot of the impetus of the mainstream academic and establishment culture of the West in the 19th and 20th century was all focused on this demystification. This sense that there was nothing to be found in the magical and the animistic world except superstition, and really these societies would just be, kind of studied as data, as they disappear. So Gerardo Reichel Dolmatov was another major figure of 20th century anthropology. He worked with Amazonian tribes like the Chicano. He also studied with the Kogi and the Arawak and wrote about them. And Dolmatov is, I think, a more sympathetic figure in many ways than Lévi-Strauss in terms of his empathy for and kind of interest in indigenous knowledge systems. But he actually did try ayahuasca in Chicano, but for him, he wrote, in a state of hallucination, the individual projects his cultural memory on the wavering screen of colors and shapes and thus sees certain motifs and personages. So once again, it's this idea that the hallucinatory, the visionary experience is simply a reflection of one's own cultural background and pedigree and so on, and it couldn't have any, validity beyond that. There couldn't possibly be a collective unconscious or a realm of archetypes, as Jung talked about. In a way. So what I would point out is that the people like Michael Domeltop and some others we'll talk about were bringing their own setting, their own belief structure in empiricism and rationalism and kind of post-Enlightenment science and materialism to these visionary experiences, and therefore they only were able to see that. They were only able to understand them as reflections of their own cultural background. However, to Michael Domeltop's credit, he did find among indigenous people, he wrote, a world with a philosophy so coherent, with morals so high, with social and political organizations of great complexity, and with sound environmental management based on well-founded knowledge. So he actually, at least by the end of his career, felt that the modern world should be, studying and kind of investigating these cultures, not just in this kind of alienated way that seemed to be more like the Levi-Strauss perspective, but really because they have core values that we could really use to establish a society that wasn't as destructive ecologically and socially. Marlena Dobkin de Rios was another early explorer of anthropology. She wrote a book about the visionary vine, psychedelic healing in the Peruvian Amazon. But she still, and this was once again back in the 60s, had the same limitation as Michael Domeltop. For her, ayahuasca visions could only be a projection of cultural memory, a reshuffling of symbols from one's own background. And she talked about seeing, these figures with the faces of leaves and so on, but then she said that no jungle creature is filled by visions. The visions I had contained symbols of my own culture. So once again, I think everything we've learned about psychedelics tell us that set and setting is crucial to the type of experience that you're able to have. So if you've already come into the experience with a closed scientific materialist worldview, you're only going to have experiences most likely that support that worldview, no matter what happens. Then we get to Michael Harner, who was an anthropologist who I believe was working in maybe the 60s also, actually. But Harner, I can't remember which group he was with. I should have had that in here, but he also drank ayahuasca with the indigenous community that he was studying. But he, for whatever reason, had a much more profound realization. Harner wrote, after drinking the ayahuasca brew, I found myself in a world beyond my wildest dreams. I met bird-headed people as well as dragon-like creatures who explained that they were the true gods of this world. I enlisted the services of other spirit helpers in attempting to fly through the far reaches of the galaxy. So he was totally in shock that this could have happened to him. He had no context for it. So the next day he went to the shaman of the tribe, an old blind shaman, and he asked him about the dragons who said they were the creators of the world. And the shaman just smiled knowingly and said, "Oh, they're always saying that, but they're only the masters of outer darkness." So at this point, Harner was totally flabbergasted, and he had to sort of acknowledge that there was a deep, multidimensional knowledge that these shamans were holding that was totally outside the framework or the parameters of the scientific, empirical worldview. And Harner, to his credit, ended up becoming a shamanic practitioner, starting a shamanic school based around soul retrieval and drumming, and wrote books like Hallucinogens and Shamanism, a book of essays that he edited, and The Way of the Shaman is one of his own books. So he really became one of the main proponents in the 70s and 80s of kind of integrating shamanism, back into modern American and European society. Another anthropologist who had kind of a breakthrough in her ayahuasca experiences was this woman, Francois Orbira Friedman. There's a wonderful essay in Ayahuasca Reader, which actually has many amazing essays in it. She was working with indigenous community in the Amazon, and she was going through kind of an apprenticeship that she was writing about as an anthropologist. But as she went forward in this apprenticeship, she began to realize there was no longer a neutral position within the shamanic game. That actually there were forces, and according to the shamans that she was working with, they had enemies, and she had to protect herself, and so on. So she found herself in the shamanic game in a very visceral sense. And there was actually kind of like a fear involved, kind of, you had to be kind of a warrior and a hunter. And she said that during one ayahuasca trip, she experienced animal transformation firsthand. She became a jaguar stalking through the forest. During this experience, she could feel, smell, she could feel, she could taste like a jaguar. The elder shaman actually visited her in the form of an eagle, and he communicated with her telepathically. And they verified that like after the ceremony. And she wrote, nothing I ever read about shamanic animalmorphosis could have prepared me for the total involvement of my senses, body and mind in this process. But actually, after this experience, she stopped her apprenticeship because she realized that if she went further, it was kind of a choice between anthropology and shamanism. So she decided to stay on the side of anthropology. One of my favorite writers on ayahuasca, and also somebody who I studied with at Columbia University, is Mick Taussig, who wrote a book about shamanism in ayahuasca shamanism in Colombia, Shamanism, Colonialism, and the Wild Man, a study in terror and healing. In that book, Taussig, or Mick, talks about kind of the tragic history of Colombia, like sort of genocides, the Indian population, the kind of atrocities that were perpetrated on part of the rubber trade and so on, and how this left kind of this traumatic wounding in the society. And the ayahuasqueros, mestizo and indigenous, had the role where they were kind of exercising this legacy of colonialist terror, and they would do it through ceremonies that were based on laughter, improvisation, creative disjunction, and so on. He talked about how he would build and rebuild neocolonial healing rituals wherein fate is wrested from the hands of God and transcribed into a domain of chance and perhapsness. So for Taussig, this was like a crucial element of the shamanic experience. It's not about, this is once again where, I see such a difference in the construct that we're now seeing develop around these experiences and these substances. And now there's a very definitive idea around like healing journey and so on. But for Taussig, the healing from shamanism actually comes from its decentering of knowledge, its deconstruction, its breaking apart of knowledge systems. And by doing that, it heals by creating an experience that falls outside of any system of knowledge or any cultural construct. Taussig talked about Roland Barthes, who wrote about what he called the third term, this kind of obtuse meaning that breaks apart systems, something that's indifferent to our categorizations, sometimes related to what's false and trivial and carnivalesque. Taussig also talked about how in Colombian shamanism, there was always this kind of every village, every town would ascribe he would say there was still a great sorcerer, a great shaman kind of in the next town. And then Taussig would actually go to the next town and try to find the great sorcerer that's it's in the next town. So this idea of this mana or this power was always kind of outside of where you were. It could never actually be located. He also talked about the tradition of the evil eye in Colombian shamanism, how everybody was kind of in perpetual terror of the power of the sorcerers and so on. Very, very, very interesting book looking at the relationship between shamanism, colonialism, and the third term, this idea of kind of something outside of discourse, outside of conceptualization. Jeremy Narby, maybe we'll talk about a little bit more in a future session. He is kind of well known for writing the book The Cosmic Serpent, And he also was a ayahuasca anthropologist working with the Ashaninka in the 1980s. Narby drank ayahuasca, and he found himself, and once again, he was coming in it as a skeptic, as an anthropologist with an outside kind of empirical worldview. He wanted to help the indigenous cultures in some ways, but he didn't expect to be, kind of directly, kind of phenomenologically brought into their kind of worldview. But when he drank the ayahuasca, he found himself surrounded by huge stone stakes, 50-foot boas. And they said to him telepathically, they explained that I'm just a human being. I feel my mind crack. And in the fissures, I see the bottomless arrogance of my presuppositions. It is profoundly true that I'm just a human being. And most of the time, I have the impression of understanding everything. Whereas here I find myself in a more powerful reality that I do not understand at all. And that, in my arrogance, I did not even suspect existed. So once again, it really depends on timing, synchronicity, who knows, karma, psychology, setting. For some of these anthropologists, they assimilated it back into a scientific materialist worldview, but then you have with him and Harner and Barbara Friedman, a phenomenological encounter with otherness that actually transforms their perspective, and they realize that the scientific, empirical, Enlightenment worldview is too limited, and actually there's something else that's accessible on a very direct and visceral phenomenological level, a different form of knowing, a different form of consciousness. Okay, so we talked about kind of philosophical sort of background with people like Marcuse and Horkheimer and Adorno, a little bit of Marx and Walter Benjamin. Now we're going to talk a little bit more about the cultural side of the integration between psychedelic shamanism, the visionary experience, and modern art and literature. Just to frame it a little bit, these were the the sort of great statements from Romanticism, which resonated throughout the 60s and so on. William Blake talked about how the road of excess leads to the palace of wisdom. And Rimbaud, who was a young French symbolist poet who only wrote for a few years from age like 16 and 19, but he talked about how a poet makes himself a visionary through a systematic derangement of the senses. So yeah, just to frame it, another aspect of 20th century intellectual history was psychoanalysis, the discovery of the unconscious. Obviously, Sigmund Freud, important figure in this regard. Freud was studying hysteria and discovered that the hysteria in a lot of his patients was related to kind of repressed libidinal impulses that would reveal themselves in dream interpretation. He discovered techniques such as free association to find these impulses and bring them to consciousness. Of course, for him, the effectiveness of psychoanalytic treatment had to do with transference, where the patient would, in a way, fall in love with the therapist and reenact their kind of Oedipal drama. With their early childhood drama or trauma, with the therapist. But for Freud, the more and more he discovered this, he discovered that there was the conscious mind was kind of a small thing compared to this vast domain of the unconscious, and that in the conscious mind from the conscious mind we repress all sorts of asocial impulses that are kind of a threat to the ego and the functional self. He developed a three-partite model of the personality: the ego, the id, and the superego. The ego being kind of like the conscious part of our psyche, self-preserving, and so on. The id being this sort of ocean of impulses and desires and hungers that the ego kind of suppresses. So actually, it's the superego that suppresses the id. The superego is what formed from the father, from society, It's the part of our psyche that keeps the id in check and under control. And Freud also saw that we had these two different drives in contrast with each other, eros and thanatos. Eros, the drive towards love and connection, and thanatos, the drive towards death and disintegration. Freud's best student, although ultimately they had a jarring breakup, was Carl Jung. Jung, in a way, could be seen as like one of the great 20th century Western kind of shamans. If you read his autobiography, Memories, Dreams, Reflections, he had tremendous, psychic experiences, dream experiences from childhood. And, he kind of discovered that, we have this much deeper level of the collective unconscious, these archetypal realms. He wrote classic books like Modern Man in Search of a Soul. For Jung, people will do anything in the modern world, no matter how absurd, to avoid facing their souls. Jung wrote about the shadow, the repressed aspects of the unconscious. And for him, there wasn't just a personal unconscious or personal shadow, but there was actually a collective shadow. There was like a collective unconscious in which these various archetypes of the psyche almost had an autonomous existence. There really isn't any particular difference between the archetypes in the collective unconscious and what shamans talk about as spirits, as Jung later admitted. Jung also wrote about synchronicities as the bridge between mind and matter. And he recognized that there was a sort of psychic nature to our existence that for Freud was totally anathema. And that was part of what they broke up about. That's just all historical context. Jung, while important in his own right, ended up getting very dismissed from kind of modernism, modern culture. Freud has been the dominant force, although Freud has also been an eclipse for a number of decades now because of kind of the rise of psychiatry, psychotherapy, the medicalization model of mental health compared to the analysis model. Surrealism was a very important art movement from the 20s. That Freud's idea of the unconscious, the world of the dream, was crucial for surrealism. Andre Breton was the sort of one who started the movement. They kind of developed in a way out of Dadaism, which I mentioned earlier. Dadaism, with the First World War, Dadaism started in Switzerland in 1916, and they just recognized the total absurdity and kind of nonsense of the contemporary world, and ended up just creating a sort of poetry of noise, performance of just nonsense and so on, just trying to break apart, the whole thing, the structure of art and culture. And Dada gave birth to Marcel Duchamp and other interesting conceptual artists and so on. Breton talks about surrealism as psychic automatism. It was a means by which one was to express verbally, a means of the written world, or in any other manner, the actual functioning of thought. So kind of like the Romantics, the Surrealists were once again kind of like a counter movement to empiricism, to science and rationality, kind of seeking to excavate the unconscious, these other worlds of consciousness. They also did experiments in how to do that through free association writing, Exquisite Corpse, a game where people would draw these, drawings together without seeing what the other one drew. Andrew Breton said, I believe in the future resolution of these two states, dream and reality, which are seemingly so contradictory, into a kind of absolute reality, a surreality, if one may so speak. So Antonin Artaud was one of the most interesting and extreme figures to arise from the Surrealist movement. He was a dramatist and a poet. He created something called the theater of cruelty. He was somebody who was really just himself on the edge of madness. The end of his life, the last, I think, decades of his life, he was in a mental institution, and maybe I think he died in the mental institution, was certified insane. But Artaud saw surrealism as a system of techniques for exploring irrational, mystical, and dissociative states, these various domains of consciousness that materialism discarded as useless and pointless. And for Artaud, surrealism showed how, quote, out of the right use of dreams could be born a new way of guiding one's thought, a new way of relating to experiences. And Artaud wrote that the revolutionary forces of any movement are those capable of shifting the present foundation of things, of changing the angle of reality. So at a certain point in the, I think the 30s, André Breton and the surrealists embraced communism, or most of them did. And Artaud at that point distanced himself from the movement because for him, communism could only be a failure because it was just about external material processes, productive processes. It didn't try to transform our internal world of thought and our internal consciousness. So I think actually Artaud is a very far-reaching and in some ways advanced thinker. In his depths of his own quest to find knowledge, to reconnect with anything sacred, this lost other reality, Artaud actually visited the Tarahumara Indians in the mountains of Mexico in 1936. The Tarahumara are known, I mean, I think they're not doing very well now, but maybe compared to the Huichol or another community that uses peyote, but they were known as tremendous runners. They would eat peyote and they would run for like 24 hours up and down the mountains, they do marathons and so on. And Artaud, I guess, learned about them continuing to use peyote. So he went there, which was at that point, very far out, like very few people traveled to these other cultures to go through these experiences. But Artaud yearned to recover what he talked about as that sense of the sacred, which European consciousness has lost, the root of all our misfortunes. And he said, there's a secret determinism based on the higher laws of the world, but in an age of a mechanized science lost among the microscopes, to speak of the higher laws of the world is to arouse the derision of a world in which life has become a museum. Artaud wrote that when he tried the peyote, it revives the memory of certain supreme truths by means of which human consciousness regains its perception of the infinite. So I recommend reading the Peyote Dance. It's a brilliant little book. I mean, he had a very difficult time. He went there, and at first they were kind of mocking him, and they were keeping him from the ceremonies, and he got sort of paranoid. But ultimately, he broke through, and he had the experience with the Tarahumara, and felt that he'd really re-accessed these kind of supreme truths by means of which human consciousness, which in the modern empirical world has been totally separate from the sacred, can regain its perception of the infinite. I love this comment from Artaud when he went down there and he was struggling to access this experience. He said, I had not conquered by force of spirit this invincible organic hostility in order to bring back from it a collection of moth-eaten imagery from which this age, thus far faithful to a whole system, would at the very most get a few new ideas for posters and models for its fashion designers. So I find that quite ironic in the what's happened over the last decade, kind of the commodification or commercialization of psychedelics in fashion and culture and art, whether with some aspects of the Burning Man festival or even here in Berlin, with the sort of neo-shamanic culture that's formed. There's a shamanic cape you can buy on Etsy, and a psychedelic photo shoot that Vogue had. Or another kind of modern artist who went deep into exploring psychedelics, mescaline, seeking to, once again, kind of excavate some lost knowledge or lost consciousness, was Henri Michaud, a French artist. He, as a young man, in his journal, he wrote, "The Earth has had all the exoticism washed out of it. If in 100 years we have not established contact with some other planet, or next best with the Earth's interior, humanity is finished. We are in mortal pain, both from the dimensions they now stand and from the lack of any future dimensions which we can turn, now that our tour of the Earth has been done to death." So he felt that in mescaline, he encountered another consciousness. He talked about that world as another consciousness. This is an example of one of the drawings he did on mescaline. And he talked about his experience on mescaline. I was shattered. I shouted to the ends of the earth. I shivered. My shivering was a barking. I pressed forward. I rushed down. I plunged into transparency. I lived crystallinely. So, just a beautiful artistic evocation of the experience of mescaline and how it kind of shakes you to the core, how it transcends you, and how it kind of leads you to the sense of encountering another consciousness outside of the human in a way. Very famous, of course, was Aldous Huxley, who wrote Brave New World, a book of a sort of dystopian future where civilization was kind of run using a narcotic, something a little between a narcotic and a psychedelic that would be given to people to sort of make them happy and kind of in line. But then Huxley also explored mescaline and wrote The Doors of Perception, and later a novel about a sort of psychedelic utopia of the future called Island. The Doors of Perception is, really one of the great books of the 20th century. It's a beautiful evocation of the psychedelic experience. A similar book, which I didn't talk about today because it is, overlaps quite a bit, is Alan Watts's book, The Joyous Cosmology. And actually, I wrote introductions for both of those books when they reissued them. But both of them really talked about all the different sort of characteristic experiences of mescaline and LSD, the value it had for sense perception, for subjectivity, for deprogramming oneself of different ideas, rediscovering creative thought, the changes it would make in your experience of time and space. Mescaline, Huxley said that he feared being overwhelmed, of disintegrating under a pressure of reality greater than a mind accustomed to living most of the time in a cozy world of symbols could possibly bear. And Huxley ended up believing in the 60s that we needed psychedelics to be used on a large scale for direct perception, the more unsystematic, the better, of the inner and outer world into which we have been born. We'll talk about Leary just a little bit. Huxley and Leary had a bit of a relationship, but they had a difference of opinion ultimately. Huxley felt that psychedelics should be distributed to the sort of Mandarin class, like the elites, the intellectual elite of society, and they sort of download the sort of new information to illuminate society as a whole. Whereas Leary, influenced by Allen Ginsberg in the 60s, decided that it was time for everybody just to take psychedelics. It was such an emergency for our civilization. We were so close to nuclear war and self-destruction that we just had to do it, as fast as possible. The Doors of Perception. Huxley realizes that the brain functions as a reducing valve, that at every moment we're getting in a tremendous onslaught of data, sense data, kind of intuitions, and so on. But our brain reduces that to a tiny trickle so that we can survive and maximize our capacity to succeed in limited environments and so on. And one of the values of psychedelics for him is it opens that reducing valve and allows us to experience more of the totality of sensory information. It's interesting actually, when particularly LSD was discovered in the 50s, one of the ideas, it was thought that it could be, the value of it was that it could be used as a schizomimetic, that it could be given to a psychologist to have a direct experience of what it was like to be a schizophrenic, and that would make them more able to treat schizophrenia. It probably does have some overlap, but it's really not akin to schizophrenia. Much, except at a very high dose, you're much more controlled. Huxley noted the tremendous time distension, and that the mescaline experience gave you a direct access to what all of the perennial traditions talk about as, mystical, perception. He wrote in Doors of Perception, my eyes traveled, I was just looking at some flowers in a boutique, in a bouquet. My eyes traveled from the rose to the carnation, and from that feathery incandescence to the smooth scrolls of sentient amethyst, which were the iris. The beatific vision, Sat Chit Ananda, being awareness bliss. For the first time, I understood, not on the verbal level, not by inchoate hints or at a distance, but precisely and completely what those prodigious syllables referred to. Sat Chit Ananda, being awareness bliss. So it really became central to Huxley's later life. In fact, on his deathbed, his wife he asked his wife to administer a very large dose of LSD to him as he went through the process of dying. Well, this is quite a long quote, sure, what the hell? So Huxley recognized that society was kind of trapped in, its conceptual structures, in this empirical worldview, in a limited frame of reference. And, he talked about Alexandrian projects. Like if you had to do, if you wanted to do some kind of like bibliography or, kind of index of some minor poet or something, you'd find support, approval, economic support, financial support. When it comes to finding out how you and I, our children, our grandchildren may become more perceptive, more intensely aware of inward and outward reality, more open to the spirit, less apt by psychological malpractices to make ourselves physically ill, and more capable of controlling our own autonomic nervous systems. When it comes to any form of nonverbal education, more fundamental and more likely to be of some practical use than Swedish drill, no really respectable person at any respectable university or church will do anything about it. I remember when I read that when I was writing Breaking Up in the Head around 2000, I felt that to 1,000 degrees. I was working as an art writer, working in a magazine called Art Forum, and the whole art critical mentality, the way they would sort of write about these, kind of uninteresting works that would fit into this kind of structure of art history and so on in this very elaborate way. It just felt like anything to avoid facing our own souls, anything to looking at, direct phenomenological practices for gaining deeper insight, becoming more intensely aware of spirit, was totally denied and denigrated by our society. And I do think that with the psychedelic renaissance, this is changing now. And that is a very salutary thing. Psychedelics are not always, something that fits into the left-wing mentality. Ernst Jünger, a very interesting, very accomplished writer and intellectual, was also, an out-and-out Nazi, and was fascinated by kind of war and rituals of destruction and so on. But he was also somebody who explored psychedelics in depth. And he actually wrote a huge book, which is finally, when I was writing Breaking Up in the Head, there was no translation for it, but now there's a translation to be found online. Approximations, Drugs and Intoxication. And, Jünger was also buddies with Albert Hofmann. They used to take LSD together. Just some quotes from Jünger to get a little vibe. Mescaline and its relatives produce an effect that is more brutal and demanding than the effect of the opiates. They transport the user not just to the visionary world and its palaces, but also bring him down to the depths of the subterranean crypts. Extremely archaic visions recover their credibility. Another quote from Jünger: the hidden fibers of the undifferentiated are found throughout the realm of diversity. Bread informs the meaning of the food of rich and poor, becomes synonymous with every gift that is even converted into a sacrament. So this is like Watts and Huxley and Jünger, they all discovered that when they took psychedelics, it was like you were suddenly able to access kind of like the meaning of phenomena, like the archetypal underlying reality of something that had become so commonplace that your reducing valve of your brain had just covered over and no longer even, saw in a real way. I mean, yeah, I'm just realizing like right now I'm looking at a rose at this flower and, I can barely see it outside of my standardized concept of rose, but if I was on LSD or mescaline, I would be seeing a whole universe in that rose and in the smell of it and so on. So it's an incredibly powerful capacity that psychedelics have. And yeah, I think it's quite interesting that Jünger had these experiences yet maintained his right-wing kind of fascist orientation. And this is also something, so, we have this tendency that psychedelics, to think that psychedelics will make people more progressive. I do think they make people more ecologically minded or ecologically aware. You have more of a sense of yourself as a sort of catalytic agent of the biosphere, in a sense. Like you feel, respiration, the plant growth, you feel more interdependent with this, gigantic being of the earth and the cosmos. But they don't necessarily tilt people left wing, and it really depends on set and setting. I mean, apparently when they gave LSD to some military planners in the 50s, it was in acid dreams, they just focused on developing bombing raids in, maybe it was in the 60s in Cambodia and so on. So I think that's an important caveat for thinking about the experience. It doesn't have an inherent morality or kind of political orientation. It's all about set and setting. Allen Ginsberg is one of my great heroes, actually. I grew up with him a little bit. My mother had been part of the Beat generation in the 50s, and he was a family friend. So I was really lucky enough to spend time with him, before he passed away. But Allen, was an incredible poet and kind of the proselytizer for the Beat generation, which was kind of the forerunner for the hippies and the counterculture of the 60s. They actually explored a lot of the same territory as the 60s: drugs, mysticism, sexual experiments, tantra, exotic travel, nomadism, but it was really coming out of a kind of urgency, like from the mid-40s when they were at Columbia University together, Ginsberg and Burroughs and Kerouac and some of their friends. They began to realize that there was a kind of stagnant quality, like whether it was the professors or people on TV or most of the people in their society, people were not really there. They weren't really conscious. They were just speaking out of kind of preconditioned knowledge. They were like preconditioned receptacles. There was no spontaneity. So the Beats in the 40s decided to sort of go on this quest to what Ginsberg talked about is resurrect a lost art or lost knowledge or lost consciousness. And so they actually undertook all of these experiments to break through these layers of programming and social conditioning. They would take drugs. They would speak, for many hours. They would do spontaneous writing. One of the sort of beat motifs is you are a genius all of the time. So it is this focus on the spontaneous, the immediate, the presence. And for me, actually, their influence was very important because when I was in the media culture in my 20s, in the 1990s, it was also kind of, still stuck in this, kind of everything was about mediated experience. Like your actual direct experience was not seen as somehow valuable compared to kind of mediated experience. And people were focused on TVs and movie shows and so on. And when I was in this kind of existential crisis that led to me writing my first book, I remembered my connection to the Beats and their whole idea that really you couldn't trust a mediated experience, and the only experience that matters to you is your direct experience. And that really fueled my desire to explore psychedelics again. Ginsberg tried mescaline. He took yahe or ayahuasca after William Burroughs did it. And he tried LSD, I think, first of all, in the early 60s at a CIA experiment, I think in Palo Alto. And he had a pretty horrible time with it at that point. She says, I thought I was trapped in a giant web of forces beyond my control that were perhaps experimenting with me, or perhaps from another planet, or from some super government or cosmic military or science fiction big brother. So once again, set and setting is always so crucial with psychedelics. And when Ginsberg took it in a clinic, he had the sense of being, enmeshed in this sort of cosmic conspiracy situation. Ginsberg integrated the insights from psychedelics into his worldview, and he gave a very wonderful and memorable Playboy interview where he believed that, instead of like protests, there should be like, orgies against the war on a large scale. He kind of shocked the interviewer from Playboy, and he said that really society should be designed to support lifestyles of ecstasy for whoever wants them. So I find Ginsberg was a great, kind of avatar of human freedom and consciousness and empathy and so on. From his early days in college, one of his best friends was William Burroughs. Burroughs was a bit older. He had a trust fund, and he became a heroin addict. He famously shot his first wife through the head during a kind of, I they would do a kind of William Tell thing where he would shoot an apple off her head and missed and killed her. And he ended up going to the Amazon to try to get off ayahuasca. He went to Colombia. He met Richard Schultes, the famous ethnobotanist in Colombia. And he ended up doing ayahuasca a number of times, but he didn't cure heroin from it. But in a way, it seems likely that yahe or ayahuasca was very, very important for Burroughs in terms of giving him the basis for his work. Burroughs talked about how yahe is space-time travel, the blood and substance of many races: Negro, Polynesian, Mountain Mongol, desert nomad, polyglot Near East Indian, new races as yet unconceived and unborn, combinations not yet realized, pass through your body. And he talked about on ayahuasca how he visited a composite city where all human potentials are spread out in a vast silent market. The city is visited by epidemics of violence, and the untended dead are eaten by vultures in the street. The sense one gets, there's a book called The Yahe Letters, which is an exchange of letters around ayahuasca between Ginsberg and Burroughs, is that actually much more than heroin, it was through the ayahuasca experience that Burroughs kind of discovered this sort of fragmented, fractured kind of narrative structure that ended up characterizing his work. Books like Naked Lunch, where it's all takes place in this kind of like city of murkiness. And also, once again, I think it's very interesting because now we have a cultural construct for what ayahuasca is supposed to be like. And you can look at many magazines and books that have kind of told us that, you might see a panther, you might see a snake, you're going to have healing visions, you might see your family and so on. But, Burroughs really didn't have any of that. And what he had was closer to what McTausig talks about, this kind of breaking apart of the containers of thought and narrative and the sense of almost like amorphousness and breakdown and this obtuse third term, this kind of something that lies outside of representation or outside reality. Terence McKenna kind of referred to something similar where he talked about the thrown away knowledge of indigenous cultures and shamanism that were outside of representation. And that was actually what gave them their power and their value. In the 60s, there was Ken Kesey, who, like Ginsberg, took LSD for the first time in a CIA experiment in California, which became this Ken Kesey and the Magic Bus drove across country, kind of making art, making films. This became a sort of archetypal voyage of the psychedelic counterculture. As we'll discuss, Leary and Richard Alpert, who worked together at Harvard, were interested in kind of scientific exploration of non-ordinary states of consciousness. But for Kesey, and his group, the Merry Pranksters, they were called. The psychedelics really just revealed kind of like the cosmic joke, kind of the sort of carnivalesque nature of existence. Famous phrase from the Merry Pranksters: "You're off on the bus or off the bus." Kesey said, "The purpose of psychedelics is to learn the conditioned responses of people and then to prank them. That's the only way to get people to ask questions. And until they ask questions, they're going to remain conditioned robots." The Magic Bus was kind of the forerunner for the Grateful Dead. And in a way, in its carnivalesque kind of approach, it sort of foreshadowed the more like domestication and commercialization of the psychedelic movement that we saw later in the 60s and 70s. Timothy Leary remains sort of a controversial figure in psychedelic history. So he was a Harvard psychologist. He took mushrooms for the first time in Mexico in 1960. He then was able to do through Harvard an experiment at Concord Prison where he gave mushrooms to inmates in the prison. And he claimed as a result that there was the recidivism rates went up, that once the prisoners got released from prison, they were much less likely to come back. But this actually apparently was not verified in his research or in future studies. And so, after a few years, Leary and some of his kind of group developed this sense of tremendous urgency. And they had this sense that the psychedelic experience needed to be spread widely as quickly as possible. And some of this was a response to, the sort of nuclear proliferation, nuclear weapons, the Cold War. We forget that the Cuban Missile Crisis really seemed like a threshold where, Russia and the US were about to annihilate each other with nuclear weapons. So, people in this sort of emergent consciousness movement were like, okay, we have to push it hard. We have to, try to raise consciousness. We have to expand people's minds. They need to know there's something else to explore. So Leary started the Harvard Psychedelic Project. Ultimately, he was expelled from Harvard. He went to Millbrook. Some rich people gave him a house there. They engaged in different psychedelic experiments. So just in 1964, with Richard Alpert, he wrote The Psychedelic Experience, a manual that was based loosely on the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which was meant to provide a kind of program or setting for people who were going through their own visionary psychedelic experiences with LSD or mushrooms. One of the things that I think it's really important to point out is, from the perspective we have now, how crazy it is that somebody who took mushrooms for the first time in 1960, and before that was kind of like a high functioning alcoholic, maybe a bit, on the narcissistic personality spectrum, in just 3 or 4 years became the go-to person in the culture for psychedelics. And it really shows that there was a total lack of initiated elders in modern American and European society, and they had to really rely on whoever they could get. So Leary, had the kind of ego to jump into this role and to make very, very broad claims and to say that, you could, everyone should tune in and turn on and drop out. And unfortunately, this really backfired. It sort of short-circuited the movement. He became demonized. He was called the most dangerous man in America by Nixon. He ended up in prison, I think, around the early 70s. Famous story of him making this crazy prison break with the help of the Black Panthers and Eldridge Cleaver, ending up in Algeria for a while. But yeah, in a way, he led a very sensational life. He was very charismatic. But in a way, he many would say that he sort of short-circuited the psychedelic movement of the 60s. But you can't really blame him because there were no elders. There was nobody to look to. We didn't have any guides. I mean, Ginsberg maybe was a better guide in some ways. Richard Alpert, later Ram Dass, worked at Harvard, was also in the psychology department there. He made the archetypal journey, which many have since followed, from the psychedelic experience to Eastern mysticism. Acid began the process of destroying his ego while opening his heart, helping him carve the path to India to his guru, Neem Karoli Baba. Ram Dass in Be Here Now writes, "I can do nothing for you but work on myself. You can do nothing for me but work on yourself." So I just want to pause on that for a second. And look at the sort of correlation between Be Here Now and Eckhart Tolle's book, The Power of Now, as kind of, how the sort of New Age, post-60s movement of consciousness in the West has kind of taken a certain form and a certain structure that you could say is quite kind of depoliticized. I mean, there's an idea of, I think Ram Dass worked with hospice care and so on, but Slavoj Zizek himself, a kind of interesting, complex political philosopher and theorist, did offer an interesting critique of kind of post-New Age mysticism and spirituality, which I'm kind of can't help but bring up because I find it fascinating. So Zizek talks about how over the last decades, European American technology and capitalism have been dominating globally at the level of economic infrastructure. The New Age Asiatic thought movement has established itself as a hegemony at the level of ideological superstructure. So I find that like a fascinating idea. Like for Zizek, New Age Asiatic thought has actually become the underlying ideology of post-industrial capitalism. There's been along with that, a pervasive shift culturally from institutional religion to direct spiritual experience, Western Buddhism, post New Age Asiatic thought, neo-shamanism is part of that. Zizek wrote, instead of trying to cope with the accelerating rhythm of technological progress and social changes, one should rather renounce the endeavor to retain control over what goes on, rejecting it as an expression of the modern logic of domination. One should instead let oneself go, drift along, while retaining an inner distance and an indifference toward the mad dance of this accelerated process. New Age spirituality seems a kind of resistance, but it is, in effect, the most efficient way for us to fully participate in the capitalist dynamic while retaining the appearance of mental sanity. So what Zizek basically points out is that this kind of Eastern slanted New Age spirituality has been fully absorbed into the capitalist system. And so we have Google engineers are taught mindfulness, microdosing is used for entrepreneurship and so on. And this idea is that essentially through meditations and these other modalities, you get an inner separation, inner peace, inner detachment. So you can still be part of the capitalist game while maintaining this sense of sanity, of separation. So yeah, this tension between psychedelics and politics in the 1960s is an interesting one. The exploration of the self, the expansion of consciousness, and then the commitment to resolving inequality, dealing with the environmental crisis, the civil rights crisis, and so on. My mother actually edited this book, Revolution for the Hell of It, by Abbie Hoffman, or Free, who was the founder of the Yippies. It was a movement sort of that essentially, in a sense, was trying to politicize the hippies and bring them into kind of activist movements in a humorous way, with this kind of playful psychedelic consciousness. So yeah, very much a prankster mentality behind it. Abbie Hoffman wrote in his book, "The first duty of a revolutionist is to get away with it. The second duty is to eat breakfast." Really fun book and an interesting thinker in his own right. However, for people who were more part of the mainstream left in the 60s, they saw the psychedelic movement as a danger. Todd Gitlin, who was the president of Students for a Democratic Society, wrote that we feared the utter frivolity which short-circuit American youth's still tenuous sense of moral obligation to the world's oppressed. The hip youth drug thing, whatever it was beyond our control, and we must have sensed that the disciplines of politics, including our own, were in danger of being overwhelmed by it. Yeah, I mean, just a little bit more. So by the end of the 60s, where we'll pick up kind of next time, psychedelics had been kind of demonized, and a number of intellectuals, thinkers had begun to see them in a much more negative way. Two examples being Norman Mailer and Hunter S. Thompson. Mailer in the book The Armies of the Night, which was on the Yippie kind of movement and their efforts to kind of do this giant exorcism of the Pentagon in the 60s. He wrote about how there was the nightmare was the echo of those trips, which had fractured their sense of past and present. The history of the past was being exploded right into the present. Perhaps there were now lacunae in the firmament of the past, holes where once had been the psychic reality of the era, which was gone. So yeah, Mailer basically was arguing that the psychedelics was doing, psychological damage to the young people in the counterculture. And similarly, Hunter S. Thompson in Fear and Loathing wrote, what Timothy Leary took down with him was the central illusion of a whole lifestyle that he helped to create. A generation of permanent cripples, failed seekers, who never understood the essential age-old mystic fallacy of the acid culture. The desperate assumption that somebody, or at least some force, is tending that light at the end of the tunnel. So yeah, with Thompson and with Mailer, it's kind of, once again, kind of the, I guess back to the skeptical empirical, toggled back to skeptical empiricism and seeing, that the sort of mystical kind of thrust of the 60s and the Romanticism was basically an illusion. And behind it was lying what Thompson talked about as meat hook realities. Yeah, so as we went into the 70s, for various reasons, the sort of psychedelic revolution that kind of fizzled, different cultural tone developed, different drugs supported it, and so on. Thomas Frank wrote a book called The Conquest of Cool, where he talked about how corporations, kind of advertising, actually were always fascinated with the psychedelic counterculture and really were assimilating it, kind of as it happened and then after. And that during the 60s, it wasn't just the counterculture, but also the American corporate culture was transforming and revolutionizing itself. And the psychedelic counterculture fed the marketing machinery of capitalism. And essentially, capitalism is incredibly brilliant at assimilating anything that it sees as a threat or an outside, and actually ultimately using it as a new energy source, as a new power source for capitalism. So yeah, the personal quest for liberation became the Nike slogan, "Just do it." There we have William Burroughs in a Nike commercial, Fruitopia from Coca-Cola. They sent buses all around the country that looked like the psychedelic pranksters bus. And Frank wrote the story of the Bohemian cultural style's trajectory from adversarial to hegemonic, the story of hip's mutation from native language of the alienated to that of advertising. So yeah, very, very, very interesting to sort of mull on that and what it means for the current moment, what could happen next. So yeah, I mean, there was, as the psychedelic 60s progressed, it was also part of a economic transition, a sort of systemic transition, where we'd gone from the sort of military-based imperialism to the finance-based capitalism, the debt-based colonialism, where the Green Revolution took over, where the Western agriculture, industrial agriculture became imposed on the world in a very direct way. And corporate capitalism absorbed the countercultural techniques, the individual freedoms, this modality of self-liberation into its sales techniques very powerfully. At the same time, we saw a wave of insurrections and guerrilla movements. So Frederick Jameson, a cultural critic, wrote in the 1960s could be seen as a properly dialectical process in which liberation and domination are combined. Jameson wrote a book called essay called Periodizing the 60s. And he talked about how the 60s, while they had the sense of revolution and playfulness, were actually this time when these sort of last surviving internal and external zones left over from free capitalism, non-commodified, traditional space, indigenous spirituality, nature, the third world, and conscious, also get assimilated, brought into the capitalist machinery, basically as Antonin Artaud had foreseen when he saw that psychedelics would feed the marketing machinery of capitalism. So the 60s were this period where systemic restructuring was taking place on a global scale. And the sense of freedom and possibility that was emerged in the 60s perhaps could be explained by this movement of the superstructural, the shift from one economic stage of capitalism to another. I just also want to talk about the Beatles for a second, or John Lennon in particular, and the influence of psychedelics on the Beatles. I mean, they were definitely the sort of archetypal, center in a way of 60s culture. And what's interesting is, starting in 62, with songs like Love Me Do and Please Please Me, the focus was on romantic love, personal attachment, love, and they ultimately, over the rapid accelerated evolution of their career, they transitioned to kind of universal collective love, from Love Me Do to All You Need Is Love, or Lennon's song Imagine. In a sense, the origins of the Beatles could be seen as part of the sort of Renaissance troubadour tradition of England and Europe, which was all about personal love and romantic love, and that they melded with Eastern mysticism, with psychedelic experience, and it led to a transition from personal love, romantic love, to agape. And agape is a Greco-Christian term referring to unconditional love, the highest form of love, charity in the Bible, the love of God for man and of man for God. So agape, the word is not to be confused with philia, brotherly love, or self-love. It embraces a universal, unconditional love that transcends and persists regardless of circumstance. It goes beyond just the emotions, to the extent of seeking the best for others. So the Beatles, John Lennon, in a way, proposed kind of a line of flight or a possibility out of the Enlightenment trap, the capitalist ego trap, to this agape, this community love, this sense of universal brotherhood and responsibility. And I think it was that tonality, that note, that made them so resonant for so many people. Okay, some final thoughts, then we can have a little more discussion, take some questions or comments. So what I'm basically proposing is that liberation and domination form this kind of dialectical process in modern civilization. The Enlightenment liberated, masses of humans and gave them comfort, gave them medicine, gave them education, but at the same time, it can create a new system of dominance and control, which we're seeing in our period right now is getting much, much more efficient and much, much more massive. And the sort of technological culture, the surveillance culture, it's kind of the technological elite and the sort of super state financial elite seem to be on the process of merging into a kind of fulfillment of the Enlightenment destiny in terms of a total control society based on kind of code in a way. It's the nature of human beings, as Benjamin said and Nietzsche said, to always live mythologically. And even this Enlightenment process is another mythological construct, right? Like this idea of this total rationality, like this idea of, there being no spirit, there being only scientific materialism. It's also its own way a myth that people are choosing to live by. So we're living in a time where the ruling myth is rationalism and materialism. But this is neither true, it's not verifiably the case, nor is it sustainable for humanity. Rationalism and scientific materialism, ultimately make people miserable, because in a way, in a world of equivalences, there's no soul, there's no spirit. There's sort of nothing really to be that excited about, really. You're just gonna, if you look at Yuval Harari, Homo Deus, he looks at a future where humanity is, there's the elites running society and everybody else is spending their lives in immersive virtual reality games. It's not a happy thought. We don't really have a new direction. We need like a new line of flight out of this technological control system. And so one way or the other, as humans, we're going to commingle with the cosmic powers. And that can either happen through initiatory rituals, ceremony, or it can be, happen unconsciously destructively through wars. As I argued in my book, How Soon Is Now, maybe in a sense we're self-willing the ecological catastrophe to force catharsis, to force an initiation for humanity. And capitalism has this capacity to neutralize and assimilate nearly anything that it finds to be a threat. And once it's assimilated, that kind of like a spider, kind of like eating a fly or something, it takes that energy from that thing and uses it to perpetuate the capitalist system. And I think we're seeing that, we're on the verge of seeing that happening with psychedelics, also with this sort of ideology of decentralization, which has some tangential relationships with psychedelics, which we can discuss. So those are my, I got one more final thought, sorry. I'm going to argue that, psychedelic shamanism remains a legitimate and vital and important line of flight, that the phenomenological experiences that, many people have recounted, like these anthropologists recounted, of actually entering another world, that actually has a visceral, tangible reality to it. And it suggests that we're just scratching the surface. We're just at the beginning of a great exploration of human consciousness. And instead of it being a world where there's no mystery left and we're closing down on possibility and turning everything into digital code or being able to express everything like that, there are actually still these tremendous mysteries within consciousness. And maybe everything in this evolutionary process is forcing us to this threshold where we focus on that. Yeah, so there are other dimensions of consciousness, other levels of reality we can access that we don't understand as of yet. non-duality, as we discussed before. Yeah, so then we have to really ask, we have to interrogate into this psychedelic kind of movement and where it's sort of taken us now, where the psychedelic experience is in a sense being reduced either to a therapy tool for mental health professionals or something that boosts creativity for entrepreneurs within this capitalist system. And we have to see that the setting and the belief structure with which you approach your experiences psychedelically have a tremendous kind of meaning. Like the intentionality really creates the effect that you're going to experience. And we have to step back and rethink about the possible utility of these substances for social change, social transformation, ecological transformation, and so on. Okay, I think that's it. Oh, one more quote from Terence McKenna, who I haven't mentioned, we'll talk about next week. McKenna, the great psychedelic thinker of the 80s and 90s, talked about how our institutions, our epistemologies are bankrupt and exhausted. We must start anew and hope that with the help of shamanically inspired personalities, we can cultivate this ancient mystery once again. The logos can be unleashed, and the voice that spoke to Plato and Parmenides and Heraclitus can speak again in the minds of modern people. When it does, the alienation will be ended because we will have become the alien. This is the promise that is held out. It may seem to some a nightmare vision, but all historical changes of immense magnitude have a charged emotional quality. They propel people into a completely new world. So, yeah, those were some of my thoughts to share with you guys today, and totally open to comments, questions.